In a small town covered in mountains, Amelia's life changed forever. One cold, rainy night. She was just 7 years old when the car she was in with her mother skidded on the slippery road. The deafening sound of the impact, followed by a dead silence, stuck in her mind like an endless echo. Amelia remembered only muffled screams and the sight of her mother, bloodied, trapped in the wreckage. The girl's world came crashing down that night. After hours of rescue, Amelia was pulled out of the vehicle alive, but her body would never be the same again. A spinal injury left her paraplegic. While she was still adapting to a new reality, the grief for her mother was a weight that crushed her daily. Her father, Rodrigo, tried to pull himself together for his daughter's sake. But months later, loneliness and pressure led him to make a rash decision: to remarry. When Claudia came into their lives, Amelia tried to open up. At first, Claudia seemed kind, promising to take care of the girl as if she were her own. However, as the months went by, the mask fell away. Rodrigo was often away, trying to support the family. And it was at these times that Claudia showed her true face. "Get up from that chair, Amelia!" her stepmother would shout, ignoring the girl's incapacity. The sound of dishes breaking in the kitchen was followed by harsh words. "You're a burden in this house." The cruelty went far beyond words. Claudia denied her food, hid her school materials, and often locked Amelia in her dark room as punishment. On one occasion, the girl tried to talk to her father. "Daddy, Claudia." "She shouts at me," stammered Amelia, her voice trembling. But Rodrigo, tired and distracted, just stroked her head and replied, "She's doing the best she can, child. Try to be understanding." The disappointment in Amelia's eyes was overwhelming. Her father, the only figure left, seemed unable to see what was happening under his own roof. One silent night, while Rodrigo slept, Amelia heard Claudia's footsteps approaching her room. The door opened and the woman whispered in a cold voice, "If you hadn't survived, everything would have been easier." The words pierced the girl's heart like sharp knives. Amelia's emotional pain was unbearable, but despite everything, something inside her refused to break. She clung to the memories of her mother, to the promise of a pure love that might one day return. However, the worst was yet to come, and Amelia had no idea that her life would be put to the test in an unimaginable way. Rodrigo left on a business trip, promising to return in a few weeks. Before leaving, he kissed Amelia's forehead and said, "Take care, my little one. Claudia is here to help." Amelia just nodded, without the strength to argue. Claudia's gaze, cold as the mist at dawn, said it all. This was going to be the worst season of her life. For the first few days, Claudia maintained a facade of normality, but as the days went by, her patience wore thin. "You're useless!" she exclaimed as she threw Amelia's dirty clothes on the floor. On the 7th day, the woman seemed to lose control completely. "Today, you're going to learn what it's like to fend for yourself," shouted Claudia. Amelia was sitting at the table, her hands trembling as she tried to hold a spoon. Before she could finish her meal, Claudia snatched the plate and threw it into the sink, letting it fall with a crash. That afternoon, Claudia dragged Amelia's wheelchair to the family van. The little girl was crying, trying to understand what was happening. "Claudia, where are we going?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. "You'll see," replied the woman, without looking back. They followed a winding road, where the pine trees covered the sky like a dark blanket. Snow was beginning to fall, covering the ground in a white, treacherous layer. The silence was interrupted only by the sound of the truck's engine. Finally, Claudia stopped in a clearing in the middle of the forest. She got out of the vehicle, opened the back door, and violently pulled out Amelia's wheelchair. The girl looked around, terrified. "Please take me back. It's too cold," she begged. Claudia just smiled, a cruel smile. "If you make it back on your own, maybe I'll take you back home," she said, before getting into the truck and driving off, leaving Amelia alone, surrounded by snow and the deadly silence of the forest. The girl screamed for help until her voice disappeared into the void. The snow was now falling hard, covering her immobile legs and the wheelchair. The darkness of night was fast approaching, bringing with it the howling of wolves in the distance. Meanwhile, Rodrigo returned home earlier than expected. He arrived home with a light heart, anxious to see his daughter. When he entered the living room, he found Claudia sitting on the sofa with a calculated expression of concern. "Rodrigo, something terrible has happened," she said, with a hand on his chest. "Amelia has disappeared. I was in the kitchen, and when I went back to her room, she was gone." Rodrigo froze, panic rising in his eyes. "What? How did this happen? Did you call the police?" "Yes, of course," lied Claudia, with fake tears in her eyes. "I looked all over the property, but I couldn't find her." Desperate, Rodrigo picked up the phone and started calling the neighbors, while Claudia watched, her cold eyes hiding the truth. In the forest, Amelia was alone, shivering with cold, while the howls grew closer and closer. The snow now covered almost all of Amelia's body, forming an icy blanket that made her shiver uncontrollably. The cold was so intense that it seemed to be sucking the life out of her. Her watery eyes could barely stay open. "Someone, please," she muttered, her voice weak. But the vastness of the forest gave her only silence, interrupted by the frightening howls that echoed through the trees. It was then that Amelia saw glowing eyes appear in the darkness. A pair of amber lights, followed by others, as if stars were fast approaching. A pack of wolves emerged from the shadows. They were huge, their robust bodies covered in thick fur, moving in a circle around her. Amelia's heart raced. There was no way to escape, no way to defend herself. She was completely at their mercy. The largest wolf in the pack advanced a few paces, growling low. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and turned her face away, expecting the worst. But suddenly, a deep, guttural sound pierced the icy air. A different kind of growl. Amelia slowly opened her eyes and saw an aged-looking she-wolf emerging from the shadows. Her gray coat was marked by scars that told stories of ancient battles. The she-wolf advanced between Amelia and the pack, facing the other wolves. Her tense body emanated authority and protection. The pack hesitated, some moving away, while others growled in response, but lacked the courage to challenge the leader. The girl watched in silence, almost in disbelief. The she-wolf seemed to be defending her. As night fell, the other wolves dispersed, giving up the attack, and silence took over again. The she-wolf slowly approached Amelia, her eyes fixed on the girls. Despite her initial fear, there was something in her eyes. Despite her initial fear, there was something in the animal's eyes that conveyed comfort. The she-wolf walked around the wheelchair, sniffing it, before carefully lying down next to the girl. The warmth of the she-wolf's body was an absolute contrast to the deadly cold of the snow. Slowly, Amelia's trembling subsided, and a strange sense of security washed over her. Are you helping me?" she murmured, as her fingers gently touched the animal's fur. The she-wolf didn't move, but her heavy breathing sounded like an answer. Meanwhile, Rodrigo was with a search party scouring the forest. The howls he heard in the distance added to his agony. "Amelia!" he shouted repeatedly, but the trees swallowed his voice. In the clearing, Amelia began to close her eyes, exhausted, while the wolf's warmth kept her alive. It was as if the animal understood that its presence was the only thing separating the girl from certain death on that brutal night. The first rays of sunlight began to appear on the horizon, painting the snow an orange hue. Amelia barely noticed, her body too exhausted to react. The she-wolf stood there, motionless, like a sentinel guarding a precious treasure. The light of dawn broke through the treetops, softly illuminating the clearing where Amelia stood. The girl's frail body was still surrounded by snow, but the wolf's warmth had kept her alive during the coldest night of her life. Amelia opened her eyes slowly, her vision blurred by exhaustion. The she-wolf was lying next to her, her head resting on her lap. When the girl's eyes met the animal's, the she-wolf lifted her head, as if realizing that she was awake. "You stayed with me," whispered Amelia, her voice still hoarse from the cold. Her trembling hands touched the she-wolf's head, feeling the texture of the rough fur. For the first time in a long time, Amelia didn't feel alone. The she-wolf stood up and began sniffing the air, as if on alert. She took a few steps around the clearing, growling low. Amelia watched, trying to understand what the animal was seeing. "Is there something there?" she asked in a low voice, even though she knew the she-wolf couldn't answer. The silence of the forest was interrupted by the sound of human voices in the distance. It was a distant echo, but enough to rekindle a spark of hope in Amelia's heart. She tried to scream, but her weak voice was barely more than a whisper. Meanwhile, Amelia's grandparents had arrived at the farm that morning. They found Rodrigo disoriented, his eyes deep with worry. "Rodrigo, what's happened?" asked his grandmother, holding her son's face. "Amelia has disappeared. She's nowhere to be found. Claudia said she left without warning, but that doesn't make sense. She would never do that," he replied, his voice trembling. Grandma frowned. "That woman has always been strange. There's something wrong here." Without waiting for further explanations, she ordered them to organize a search of the forest. With flashlights and sniffer dogs, they spread out through the woods. Rodrigo walked with quick steps, calling his daughter's name incessantly. The sound of voices and barking approached the clearing where Amelia was. The she-wolf raised her head again, looking in the direction of the voices. Suddenly, she let out a long, deep howl, a sound that reverberated through the forest. Amelia looked at her gratefully. "Are you warning them?" The sniffer dogs picked up the scent and started running. Rodrigo and his grandparents heard the howl and headed in its direction. When they reached the clearing, they stopped, stunned by what they saw. Amelia was there, covered in snow, fragile but alive. Next to her, a gray she-wolf was protecting her, her eyes fixed on the newcomers. Rodrigo ran to his daughter, falling to his knees beside the wheelchair. "Amelia! My God, you're alive!" he shouted, hugging her tightly. "Daddy!" "She saved me," whispered the girl, pointing at the she-wolf. The she-wolf took a few steps back, calmly observing the scene. When the sniffer dogs approached, she let out a warning growl, making them stop immediately. Then, as if she understood that her role was over, the she-wolf turned and disappeared into the forest without making a sound. Rodrigo held Amelia, tears streaming down his face. "I'll never let that happen again, my love. I promise," he said, his voice full of guilt and relief. The grandparents wrapped the girl in a thick blanket as the group returned to the farm. In everyone's eyes, there was the same unspoken question. How had she managed to survive? But Amelia knew. She knew she owed her life to that mysterious she-wolf. The walk back to the farm was slow, but full of emotion. Amelia, wrapped in blankets, was silent, still trying to process what had happened. Rodrigo pushed his wheelchair carefully, but his eyes were glazed over, guilt eating him up inside. When they arrived at the farm, Amelia's grandmother was blunt. "This girl can't stay here with you any longer, Rodrigo. It's clear that something very serious has happened." I didn't know," mumbled Rodrigo, his voice almost inaudible. He sat down, his hands shaking, while the image of his daughter alone in the snow haunted him. "I didn't know why you chose not to see," shouted his grandmother, her tone full of anger and pain. "That woman, Claudia, should never have set foot in this house. Ever since she arrived, she has brought nothing but suffering to Amelia." Before Rodrigo could reply, Claudia entered the room, trying to keep her expression calm. "What's going on here? What's all the shouting about?" Amelia's grandmother turned to her, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You dare ask? You abandoned a helpless child in the snow and lied to Rodrigo. Your cruelty knows no bounds." Claudia tried to defend herself. I don't know what you're talking about." Amelia left on her own. I did everything I could to look after her." "Bullshit!" Amelia suddenly shouted, her voice weak but full of determination. "You left me there. You said that if I wanted to go back, I'd have to do it alone." The room fell into a tense silence. Rodrigo stood up slowly, his expression now hardened. He looked at Claudia with cold eyes, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You did that?" His voice was low, but threatening. Claudia took a step back, stuttering. "Rodrigo, I just wanted to teach her a lesson. She's so spoiled and difficult." "Enough!" Rodrigo exploded, pointing to the door. "Get out of this house now. I don't ever want to see you near Amelia or my family again." Claudia tried to argue, but Amelia's grandmother was already pulling her by the arm, leading her firmly out of the door. "If I hear that you've tried to come back, I'll make sure to report you," she said, before slamming the door. The house fell silent again. Rodrigo sat down next to Amelia, holding her hand tightly. "I'm sorry, my little one. I should never have let this happen. I'll never let you suffer again." His grandmother intervened gently. "Rodrigo, we need to think about Amelia's future. She's coming with us. You can visit her, but for now, she needs stability and love, things she hasn't had here." Rodrigo hesitated, but knew his mother was right. He nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "It's okay. I just want the best for her." In the days that followed, Amelia was taken to her grandparents' house. There, she found the affection and protection she had longed for. Rodrigo visited often, determined to make amends, but something unexpected happened. A week later, while Amelia was in the courtyard, she heard a familiar sound. The wolf's howl echoed through the forest. Her heart raced. She looked up into the trees, and there it was, the she-wolf, watching her from afar. A shy smile appeared on the girl's face. "You're back," whispered Amelia. The she-wolf didn't approach her immediately, but continued to watch her, like a silent guardian. The connection between them couldn't be explained, but it was clear. The she-wolf had chosen Amelia, and it seemed she wasn't going to abandon her. The days at her grandparents' house brought a relief that Amelia had never experienced before. Every morning, she felt the warmth of a real home, full of love and care. Her grandmother made a point of looking after her personally, while her grandfather took her for walks around the yard, telling her stories about the simple but meaningful life on the farm. But even surrounded by so much love, something continued to lurk in Amelia's thoughts. The wolf. Every night, when silence overtook the property, she would hear a distant howl that seemed to be a message of protection. One afternoon, while Amelia was sitting in the courtyard, Rodrigo arrived to visit her. He looked haggard, with deep circles under his eyes and hunched shoulders, as if he were carrying the weight of all the wrong choices he had made. "Hello, my little one," he said, kneeling down beside the wheelchair. Amelia looked at him with calm eyes, but without hiding her hurt. "Why didn't you protect me, Daddy?" The question, so simple and direct, hit Rodrigo like a punch in the gut. He held his daughter's hand tightly, his voice trembling as he replied, I failed you. I didn't see what was right in front of me, but I promise, Amelia, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." The grandparents watched from afar, allowing father and daughter to have that moment. Rodrigo began to visit her every day, bringing books, flowers, or just himself. Little by little, the barrier between them began to dissolve. Meanwhile, the she-wolf's presence remained a mystery. At night, she would appear at the edge of the forest, sitting like a silent sentinel. Amelia began to leave pieces of bread or meat on a plate in the courtyard. In the morning, the food always disappeared. One night, while everyone was asleep, Amelia heard a soft sound coming from outside. She rolled her chair to the window and, to her surprise, saw the she-wolf sitting on the patio, her amber eyes shining in the moonlight. "You're here," whispered Amelia, her voice laced with an emotion she barely understood. She opened the window with difficulty and held out her hand. The wolf hesitated for a moment, but then took a few steps towards the girl. Finally, the animal's muzzle touched Amelia's hand. It was a gesture of trust, a renewed bond between two souls who had saved each other that night in the forest. The next morning, when the grandparents saw the paw prints in the courtyard, they said nothing, but exchanged meaningful glances. They knew that the she-wolf's presence was something special, something that went beyond the natural. Rodrigo, for his part, continued to redeem himself. He finally sold the farm where so many painful memories had been created and started building a house near Amelia's grandparents, determined to be part of her life in a more present and responsible way. As the days turned into weeks, Amelia began to blossom. She laughed more often, took part in activities on the farm, and, above all, felt safe. And whenever she was in the courtyard, the she-wolf was not far away, like a silent and faithful guardian. The months passed, and Amelia began to rebuild her life. Her grandparents' farm became a safe haven where she rediscovered the joy of life. Rodrigo's visits were constant, and he made a point of being present at every important moment. Little by little, the father and daughter began to heal the wounds of the past. But there was something no one could explain: the she-wolf. The relationship between the animal and Amelia grew stronger every day. Whenever she was in the courtyard, the she-wolf would appear from a distance, watching silently, or sometimes coming close enough to accept petting from the girl. One sunny afternoon, while Amelia and her grandfather were resting under the shade of a tree, the she-wolf appeared again. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 cubs staggered around, playing awkwardly in the grass. "She trusts you," said Grandpa with a warm smile. "She brought her family to meet you." Amelia was amazed. She watched the cubs with a mixture of fascination and joy, while the she-wolf remained close by, vigilant. The girl held out her hand and, one by one, the little ones approached her, sniffing her before nestling around her. "They're so cute," said Amelia, laughing for the first time in a long time. Rodrigo, who was watching from afar, approached carefully. "It's like she knows you're special, Amelia, that you deserve to be protected," he said, his eyes watering. The she-wolf looked up at Rodrigo as if she understood his words. For a moment, it seemed that there was an inexplicable connection between them. Rodrigo knelt down beside Amelia and touched the she-wolf's head gently. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice laden with gratitude, "for saving my daughter and for never abandoning her." The following days were filled with visits from the she-wolf and her cubs. They seemed to integrate into the daily life of the farm, becoming part of Amelia's life. The grandparents, although intrigued, accepted the presence of the wolves as something special, almost magical. But as time went by, the visits began to diminish. The she-wolf and her cubs appeared less frequently, until one day they disappeared completely. Amelia felt an emptiness, but knew that this was part of nature. One morning, as she looked out over the forest from the courtyard, she heard one last howl. It was long, deep, like a farewell. She smiled, with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Years later, when Amelia was a young woman, she still talked about the she-wolf and the night she was rescued in the snow. For her, the she-wolf was not just a wild animal, but a symbol of strength, resilience, and loyalty. Rodrigo, who never forgot his promises, continued to be a present and loving father. Amelia flourished under the care of her family, becoming an inspiration to everyone around her. And although he never saw the she-wolf again, he knew that her guardian would live on in his heart, as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is something or someone willing to save us.